Imagine finding a loaf of bread that was baked more than 3,000 years ago. Not a picture, not a recipe. The actual bread dry, cracked, and still recognizable. Ancient Egypt left us something extraordinary, food that survived its bakers. Some surviving loaves were deliberately placed inside tombs. One loaf now at the Metropolitan Museum was discovered among food placed in the tomb of Hatnefer during Egypt's New Kingdom. Look closely enough, and a loaf becomes evidence. Its grain air bubbles, crust, shape, and microscopic structure can reveal how flour was prepared, whether fermentation occurred, and how ancient bakers controlled heat. To follow that evidence, imagine Kiti, a fictional bakery apprentice living beside the Nile thousands of years ago. Before sunrise, his job begins not at the oven, but with something far more fundamental: grain. Bread was not a side dish. Together with cereal-based foods and beer, it formed a major foundation of the Egyptian diet. Ordinary meals depended heavily on grain, while meat was less routinely available to most people. So how did grain become bread without steel mills, electric mixers, thermostats, or modern ovens? Follow one kernel from the Nile floodplain to Kiti's bakery, and the answer becomes a story of agriculture, labor, chemistry, and remarkable skill. Egypt's agricultural world depended on the Nile Valley. Grain fields grew in fertile land close to the river, making cereals such as emmer wheat and barley essential crops within the ancient Egyptian food system. One of the most important grains was emmer, an ancient form of wheat. Unlike many modern wheats, its grain remains tightly enclosed in husks after threshing, making processing more labor-intensive. Barley also mattered. Archaeological and textual evidence shows both barley and emmer in Egyptian cereal production, especially within bread and beverage economies, where grain processing happened on an enormous scale. When the crop was ready, workers cut the grain and gathered it into bundles. Tomb imagery repeatedly shows agriculture, because food production was central, not only to survival, but to the Egyptian economy and ideas of eternal abundance. Harvesting was only the beginning. Grain still had to be separated, cleaned, and prepared. Ancient scenes show workers sifting and cleaning flour and grain before dough reached the bakers. To Kiti, this grain is breakfast. To a temple administrator, it is also accounting. Grain could be stored, distributed, processed into bread, and used as part of payments and institutional provisioning. Today, flour arrives in a bag. For Kiti's world, flour represents hours of physical work. The grain must first become something fine enough to hydrate, bind, ferment, shape, and bake. A common tool was the saddle quern, a broad stone surface paired with a handstone. Grain was rubbed back and forth rather than spun through a rotary mill. Grinding installations are known archaeologically from Egyptian production sites. Push-pull, gather, grind. Again, the movement looks simple, but producing enough flour for families, workshops, temples, or large institutions require relentless repetition. Ancient flour was not automatically one crude texture. Experimental archaeology shows that people using these tools could control grinding and create different degrees of fineness through repeated processing. The flour could then be sieved. A tomb scene from the Old Kingdom shows flour cleaning and sieving alongside kneading and baking, almost like an ancient production flowchart carved onto a wall. That matters, because ancient baking was more sophisticated than the stereotype of crude grain smashed into an accidental loaf. Microscopic studies of surviving Egyptian bread revealed deliberate cereal processing, and in some examples, evidence of malt and yeast. At its core, bread begins when ground cereal meets liquid. Flour particles absorb water, the mixture thickens, and something loose and powdery suddenly becomes one connected mass. The famous Middle Kingdom bakery and brewery model from the tomb of Mekhetru shows workers mixing dough in tall vessels, while others tend ovens and shape bread nearby. No powered mixer separates the baker from the dough. Texture is judged directly through hands, resistance, moisture, and experience. Kiti learns not from a digital recipe, but by watching experienced workers and repeating their movements. Some was not. Ancient Egyptian bread came in a remarkable variety of forms. Actual loaves and artistic evidence show that Egyptian breads cannot be reduced to one flat disk. Some ancient Egyptian bread was leavened. Microscopy of preserved remains has shown that at least some bread included yeast, demonstrating that Egyptian bakers were working with fermentation, not merely baking dense flour and water cakes. Kiti cannot see yeast organisms, but he can see what they do. A quiet dough changes with time. It expands, softens, develops aroma, and becomes filled with pockets that will transform in the oven. Bread-making methods changed over Egypt's long history. Archaeologists have found multiple oven forms, hearths, trays, and ceramic bread molds. the bakery was a technology that evolved, not one frozen invention. An Old Kingdom tomb scene shows a baker heating oval bread molds over a small fire. Dough could then be placed into the heated vessels for baking. The Mecatra bakery model shows baked conical loaves and workers tending ovens. Archaeological models like this are invaluable because they preserve an entire workflow in miniature. At the mortuary complex of Senwosret III, archaeologists found evidence for extraordinary bread forms, including long breads produced in ceramic cylinders and large flat loaves made on trays. Some long ceramic bread molds apparently had to be broken to release the finished bread intact. Archaeologists found thousands upon thousands of mold fragments at one temple production complex. Inside the heat, water turns to vapor, fermentation gases expand, starch changes, and the outside dries into crust. Ancient bakers did not need modern chemistry vocabulary to recognize the transformation. They needed experience. Bread could be produced at home, but Egypt also had organized bakery operations connected with temples, estates, settlements, and institutions. Some sites reveal production far beyond one family's daily needs. At Senwosret III's mortuary temple, archaeologists excavated an economic production area known as a shina. Its work included provisioning the temple, producing food, and helping support its workforce. One group processes grain, another grinds. Others mix, shape, heat molds, manage ovens, count finished bread, and move supplies. The system resembles a production line, but powered almost entirely by human labor. At Amarna, archaeological evidence suggests large-scale bread and drink production could be achieved by repeating many relatively small production units, instead of relying on one enormous industrial machine. At the Senwosret complex, excavators recovered roughly 17,000 broken bread molds. That number transforms bread from a domestic image into something closer to logistics. Kidi's single basket now makes sense. One baker cannot feed an institution, but hundreds of repeated actions, each ordinary on its own, can sustain workers, rituals, administrators, and entire communities. Ancient Egyptian economic life did not depend on modern salaries and coins in the way ours does. Institutional workers could receive compensation and provisions in goods, and bread and grain were central to those systems. Standardized bread molds and trays helped institutions control portions. When food functions as part of payment or rationing, the size of a loaf becomes an accounting problem. Ancient Egyptian mathematical texts even include problems involving bread and beer quantities. Food production required measurement, division, record-keeping, and the practical mathematics of feeding people. This is one reason bread mattered far beyond the dinner table. Grain moved through storerooms and institutions, and finished food could become part of the system that kept labor operating day after day. A monument may be built from stone, but the people moving that stone still need calories. Large Egyptian institutions depended on reliable food production, and bread was part of the infrastructure behind visible achievements. We celebrate pyramids, temples, sculpture, and writing. But a civilization also depends on quiet technologies repeated every morning: grinding, measuring, fermenting, heating, distributing, and knowing how to turn grain into dependable food. Egyptians did not think food mattered only during life. Tombs could contain real provisions, images of food production, models of bakeries, and offerings intended to sustain the deceased symbolically in the afterlife. The bakery and brewery model from Mecatra's tomb is especially powerful. Tiny wooden workers grind, mix, shape, and bake so that an entire food-producing world accompanies the tomb owner into eternity. Bread also belonged to temple offering systems. At institutional complexes, bread production helped provision both human workers and religious activity. The same staple connected stomach, economy, and ritual. Egypt's dry conditions sometimes preserved organic material that normally disappears. That extraordinary preservation is why museums today can hold actual ancient bread instead of relying only on paintings or texts. Some preserved Egyptian bread even carries physical marks left during preparation. A New Kingdom bread example in the British Museum has hand impressions that may have been left by its baker, and suddenly ancient Egypt becomes less distant. Someone pushed that dough, someone checked that oven, someone carried that loaf. Technology changes, but the basic human act of making food for another person feels immediately familiar. Do not imagine a modern factory loaf transported backward through time. Ancient Egyptian breads could differ radically in grain, texture, fermentation, shape, moisture, and baking method. Emmer behaves differently from the refined modern wheat used in many breads today. Ancient milling also preserved more of the cereal structure. helping create breads with textures and flavors unlike a standard modern sandwich loaf. Archaeological microscopy overturned older assumptions that Egyptians